Happy New Year and good morning, everyone. Welcome to the January 2024 edition of the Southeast Monthly Climate Webinar, where we talk about the climate and special topics pertaining to the Southeast region. I'm Chris Fuhrmann, the Deputy Director of NOAA's Southeast Regional Climate Center, and I'll be giving a climate overview of the past couple months since our last webinar back in November. Our other speakers today are Todd Hamill from the Southeast River Forecast Center, who will provide a water resources update, Pam Knox from the University of Georgia, who will provide an agricultural impacts update. And joining us today, we have Karin Gleason from NOAA's National Centers for Environmental Information, who will be giving us a recap of the weather and climate in the Southeast over the past year. So again, thank you all for joining us this morning. Just a reminder to type your questions and comments into the question box at any time, and they'll be answered at the end. Also, a recap email of this webinar will be sent out with a YouTube link to the recording in the next day or so. All right, so let's get started with an overview of the climate. So temperatures over the past 2 months have been mostly below average, especially across the Florida Panhandle, much of Alabama, Georgia, and Tennessee, where some locations have been running over 2 degrees below average since late November. On the other hand, we saw some above average temperatures across South Florida, eastern portions of the Carolinas, and northern Virginia, and especially across parts of Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. In fact, several long-term stations on these islands, including San Juan and St. Croix, are off to one of their warmest starts to the winter season on record. Okay, next slide. So as is often the case, particularly this time of year, mean temperatures don't always tell the complete story. Over the past couple months, we've seen a number of different weather patterns across the region that have contributed to much variability in temperature. On the left, we see that daily maximum temperatures reached 70 degrees across a good portion of the region, with some parts of Florida approaching 90 degrees, while minimum temperatures have dropped below freezing as far south as the Florida Panhandle, with large portions of the region dropping into the teens and some places dropping below zero, especially over the past couple of weeks. These cold temperatures have even contributed to winter precipitation in places like Mobile and Pensacola. Okay, next slide. These active weather patterns have also contributed to severe weather across the region. You may recall a similar situation last January, highlighted by a major tornado outbreak that's shown there on the far left. That month, we saw the second highest number of confirmed tornadoes in January since SPC records began in 1950. So far this year, there have been 36 confirmed tornadoes, most of which occurred during an outbreak back on the 9th of the month. And of course, this number may change as more surveys are finalized and more events occur, but it currently stands as the third highest number of confirmed tornadoes in the month of January. All right, next slide. So in terms of precipitation, it's been quite wet across the eastern portion of the region, especially across the Florida Panhandle, central portions of North Carolina, and eastern portions of Virginia, where some locations have recorded nearly double their expected amount over the past 2 months. However, much of Tennessee, Alabama, and central portions of Georgia have remained relatively dry. And although we're back in the dry season, rainfall deficits have started to build again in parts of the Caribbean, as you can see in the anomaly map on the right. In fact, rainfall across nearly all of Puerto Rico has been below average over the last 2 months. Okay, next slide. In terms of the places that have received quite a bit of precipitation, many of the season-to-date totals since December 1st rank as the wettest or one of the wettest starts to the winter on record. And as we'll see here in a minute, this trend is forecasted to continue into this upcoming spring. Okay, next slide. All right, so no surprise, these precipitation patterns line up with the current drought monitor, which shows significant improvements across much of the region over the past couple of months. Areas of severe and extreme drought that we saw across the interior of the region back in late November have been eliminated or cut back dramatically, though there are still parts of Tennessee and Alabama where drought persists. The eastern portion of the region, however, is largely drought-free, except for an area of drought along the west coast of Florida that's persisted since last spring. Since late November, the proportion of the region in at least moderate drought has declined by nearly 45%, while the area in at least severe drought has declined by about 35%. Okay, next slide. And if we look over the next week, this is the 7-day QPF. This is actually from last night, so it's changed just ever so slightly this morning, but still the same story. We're likely to see even more improvements in the drought monitor here moving forward, as parts of Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee, and western North Carolina could see over 3 inches, and in some places maybe over 5 inches of precipitation through Monday, next Monday. Okay, next slide. Looking in the Caribbean, we see drought expanding again across Puerto Rico, which has been dry and warm over the past couple months. Severe drought continues to persist on St. Thomas. Moderate drought has persisted on St. Croix. Okay, next slide. So looking at ENSO, we see that we remain in an El Nino advisory with oceanic and atmospheric conditions reflecting a strong event that's expected to continue for the remainder of the winter, then gradually weaken with a transition to ENSO neutral during the spring months. Now, it should be noted that while El Nino conditions may be weakening, the impacts could last through much of the spring season, and that's at least partially reflected in the outlooks that we'll look at here in just a minute. Following this transition to ENSO neutral, there are increasing odds of a La Niña developing later in the spring and summer, though confidence remains fairly low at this point and will likely stay that way until we cross the spring predictability barrier here in a few months. This is also reflected in the model prediction plume shown on the right-hand side there. Okay, next slide. All right, so because we're still in an El Nino, the projections over the next few months are more or less consistent with that pattern. Near normal temperatures are expected across much of the southern tier of the region, with above average temperatures slightly favored across northern Virginia, and we see equal chances in between. Above average precipitation is favored across virtually the entire region, except for much of Tennessee, where equal chances prevail over the next 3 months. Okay, next slide. And looking here across the Caribbean, we see that above average temperatures are forecasted to continue over the next 3 months with near average precipitation. Okay, next slide. Looking at the seasonal drought outlook, we see that improvements are expected across Alabama and Georgia, with drought expected to persist across Tennessee and the Caribbean, and that's where seasonal projections are a bit more uncertain and in general less favorable for drought improvement. Okay, next slide. All right, so looking ahead to next week, the January thaw is upon us. Above average temperatures are likely across much of the region, while precipitation is leaning above average across the eastern half of the region and below average across the western half. Okay, next slide. Okay, looking out to 2 weeks as we turn the calendar to February, we see a continuation of above average temperatures, except across Florida, while a somewhat drier pattern sets up across much of the region. Next slide. And then finally, as we get into mid-February, it's looking like above average temperatures will persist across the northern tier of the region, with wetter than normal conditions across the southern tier. Okay, we should have the summary there on the final slide. If there's a summary for you to look over after the webinar, I'm also happy to answer questions at the end. And with that, I'll turn it over to Todd.
Thank you, Chris. Okay, well, let's get started. As was mentioned, this has been a very interesting couple of months. And so we often show the 28-day average stream flow. This time I'm going to show the 7-day average stream flow, and I'm going to do it for all of the different states. I apologize. I think I forgot to change a couple of the titles on them, but we're looking at 7-day average stream flow across the Southeast. And if you look on the left side, you can kind of see what Chris was talking about with the drought and where we have drought and where we don't. And in parts of northern Mississippi, northern Alabama, our stream flows remain below normal. And because of that, the drought persists in some of those areas, even though we've started to see some rainfall. And so we'll be watching that very closely, especially over the next 7 days, because it looks like we might be creeping out of that with all the rainfall coming. And on the right-hand side shows a duration hydrograph, and it kind of shows where we were back in November when we had our last call, where we had been very, very dry, and we had gone from being wet in time during September and then moved on. So let's go ahead and go on to our next slide and look at the rest of the Southeast. And so we'll look at Alabama, and you can see in Alabama, this is the 7-day average stream flow. And one of the things that we're in the winter, so there aren't many leaves on the trees. There isn't many things to hold up that water when it hits the ground and gets to the stream flows. So we're much more sensitive to these short rainfalls. However, they do come down much more quickly. So you can see in Alabama that we were dry up in through December and starting in early January, and then we jumped up fairly quickly. We jumped up and have come down. And so we've come down very quickly, and part of that's because we were dry to begin with. So the water gets into those streams and then it immediately comes down. So it does show a little bit of the sensitivity in that area. And then so you can see as we go into Georgia, it still shows some of that sensitivity, but those wiggles and those rainfall totals, they're a little bit higher. So we're remaining in the normal to above normal area in Georgia right now. So we've come out of that drought that we've been talking about. We still have a few little drought issues in the northern part of the state, but it looks like those will be taken care of as we go through the next week. As we go to Florida, they remain above normal. It's interesting because when we start to talk about stream flows and in different parts of Florida, this really is their dry season for this time of year. So for them to be receiving some of the rain that they've been receiving, this isn't something they expect. Lake Okeechobee is one of those things where they look to get rid of some of that water during this time of year to be able to get ready for their wet season, to be able to handle all the water that comes in there. And that's if we don't start seeing some drier periods, it could become an issue for many of those areas as we get into the wet season looking later into the year. So let's go ahead and move on to the eastern seaboard, and we'll start with South Carolina. And South Carolina, again, we were talking about drought for much of the fall, and for good reason. They remain dry. A lot of their reservoir levels were below normal, but they have since, as we got into December, have since come out of that, and they've seen a great deal of flooding in South Carolina and a great deal of water in South Carolina. And as Chris mentioned before, this has been one of the wettest winters they've ever seen up to this point. So the same goes for North Carolina as we start to look at North Carolina, and we see that they're also extremely wet for this time of year, almost record flows for that 7-day period as we got to the beginning of January with all the rain that they received. And Virginia is much the same way. In a lot of our area, we mostly in the central parts and it's my understanding, I hear that the northern parts are still having a little bit of trouble recovering from the dryness that they had in the fall, but for the most part, they are starting to see significant recovery. So let's go on and look at the snapshot of today and where we are with our flooding in the southeast. All the rain that we've seen in the last couple of weeks has moved down towards the coast and is really starting to move closer to the coast, getting us ready for our next set of rainfall, which will likely fall again at the headwaters, the northern part near the mountains and so forth, and move downstream again. So it does in a lot of these places, it will take up to a couple of weeks for it to make it through all those systems so that all the flooding gets out of the area. But as you can see, we're still in flood from our recent rainfall in a lot of the areas close to the coast, and we'll start that process, it looks like, all over again as we go into the next week's heavy rainfall. So let's go ahead and go on to the next slide. So where are we with respect to our climatology? The one thing that we can say about this is that this is not unusual. This is typical for this time of year. We do expect flooding. We expect flooding in the southeast, at least somewhat. Now, we have seen some maybe slightly more exceptional floods. We've had some major floods in the area from the extreme rainfall that we had, but this is not unusual. We expect to have flooding during this time of year. It's also the time of year we expect recharge of the soils. And so, so this isn't unusual. We do expect this at different times of the year, and this is the time we would expect that. So our peak doesn't really come till the month of March. So we've got a long season ahead of us. And like I said, after this week's rainfall, we'll likely be mostly out of the drought and mostly be concerned about river flooding for the rest of the winter and into early spring. So let's go and look at Florida's climatology. So this is kind of the opposite, obviously. I was just talking about this before. This is usually their dry time of year, unless we're in an El Nino. A lot of these floods that you see during this time have been during El Nino years. And so we don't expect flooding except during that time. And so we really haven't seen any in Central Florida. Most of the Florida flooding we've seen has been up in the Swanee Basin, up in the northern part of Florida. And we'll still be watching for that because some of these systems are moving far enough south to bring rain into those areas. And with all that moisture moving out of the Gulf, they are still starting to see some rainfall. And again, it's a concern for some of those areas like Lake Okeechobee that aren't having a chance to recover during the dry season like they would expect, because we will be heading into their wet season as we get into late spring and early summer. So I'm going to show, in the next graphic, I'm going to show something that we showed earlier in the year, kind of our winter flood outlook. And I've gone January through March now, but I wanted to show this because I was sort of skeptical as we were going into it. This looks back at historical years when we've had El Niños and what we would expect on stream flows. And I was very skeptical about, and as you look at the January, that red, all the red and the below normal in there. And I thought, I can't see how we can have that. Well, these systems have been digging far enough south and into the Gulf. And so most of our rain has ended up being in Georgia and Alabama and the southern part of our area, and then the eastern part of our area. So this is why, even as we look in a retrospective in the next couple of years at this year, we've been dry in these first couple of months. So it will show up in that way. So I think this is a lot of the reason that we see some of that. As we get into February and March, we see a lot less of the red. So it ends up encompassing more of the southeast, these rainfalls, where our stream flows are either normal or above normal, and much less is below normal, with just slight chances for below normal. So I think this is the case, and we can see that each of these systems has affected a little different part of the southeast, and we're finally getting to it where it's impacted the whole southeast. It's likely at the end of this next week or week and a half that we will see that it's impacted the whole southeast, and most of our stream flows are either near normal or above normal. So let's go ahead and go to the last slide. And so we are looking at above normal risk for flooding. We're obviously more concerned with widespread flooding across the southeast, and that will be very, very busy through the rest of this spring, or the rest of this winter and into early spring. And we will see once we get to summer, because the late spring looks continued wet, and then we'll see with La Niña as we get into the summer. There's still a lot of uncertainty with that, so we'll have plenty of time to talk about that. And so the last is just my summary slide, and so this is for you to look at later. So if you have any questions, I'll be around. Now we'll go on to Pam.
All right. Well, thank you, Todd. I appreciate that. I could talk for a long time about ag impacts. You wouldn't think there'd be too many this time of year, but I won't, because we want to make sure we save time for Karin. So we go on to the first slide. There's a lot of words on this. Basically, they sum up to three things I wanted to talk about, and I'll go into in subsequent slides. The improvements in the drought and the lingering effects of drought in some places, the effect of colder weather on pastures and citrus, and then the chill hour accumulation. So even though it's been a pretty quiet time for farmers to be out in the field, they're all sitting in meetings right now. I have to go talk to the corn growers this afternoon and talk about the outlook for this coming year. Everybody's busy, they're just not out in the fields yet. So if we go on, the improvements in soil moisture has really helped with the drought. This is the drought improvement over the last 8 weeks, pretty much since our last webinar. And you can see that some places have increased by 3 categories or more. improvement in with all the rain that we've had that Chris talked about earlier. Other places, not as much. And we'll be looking for some continued relief in some of the regions, especially in Alabama and Northwest Georgia, that have not had as much, well, they were worse to begin with, so it's taken longer for them to come out of the drought. So that's something we'll be looking at. If we go to the next slide. The drier conditions, I should say, were a problem for forage producers because the forage and small grains couldn't really germinate in the fall, and so a lot of the farmers were feeding hay, and some are still having a lack of hay, and they're having problems. They've had to cull some cattle. So that has been a problem, but the improvement in drought did allow some people to get in things at the last minute. Other places, they're just going to have to wait till spring to really start planting. The second thing I wanted to mention was the cold conditions that we've had. This is a couple of pictures from Dr. Shahid down at Florida, trying different techniques for preserving the graft junction. They have one rootstock, and then they put a different graft of a tree on top of it, and the goal is to keep that graft between the two living, so that when the tree comes out of the cold weather, it's ready to grow with that desired variety of citrus on top. So you can see some of the ice that's been forming from that there. That cold weather has been good for peaches because we've accumulated a lot of chill hours, and I'll show that in just a minute. A lot of the citrus, in the southwest part of Georgia got down into the low 20s, but most of the citrus trees, unless they were just really recently planted, probably survived. It's a little too early yet to see what the damage is. You have to wait for them to start blooming, start greening up in the spring. But I think I've heard cautiously optimistic conditions for getting through this cold weather. Now, we probably will go back into cold weather later in February. Wouldn't necessarily be as cold as we were earlier this year, but it's something to keep in mind. So if we go on to the next slide. The soil temperature is looking about average. Soil moisture for most of the region has been close to the average. This is the 20 centimeters, so that's just the shallow layer. You can see the dry, lingering drought conditions in the northeast part of Alabama and northern Georgia, and then far western North Carolina. But some of that will probably be eliminated with this latest batch of really wet conditions that we're going to have. Florida has been relatively wet, considering it's the dry season especially, and eastern North Carolina as well. But typically looking pretty good. No big flashing lights at this point for soil temperature and soil moisture. If we go on. Just wanted to spend a couple minutes thinking about frost. This is from 2023 last year, and I picked Augusta because it's sort of halfway between Georgia and South Carolina in the peach growing region. You can see there's that period from mid-February to mid-March where the temperature was consistently way above normal. And the red line there I just drew in to indicate where the freezing 32-degree line is. So even though the frost wasn't that late, it was probably a 1 in 10 frost in some areas, but even closer to average in a lot of them. It still made a big problem because the trees had enough chill hours to start blooming, and then we went to that frost, and it really caused problems. I think what we're going to see this year is, we're going into a warmer pattern. It will probably last until about mid-February or so, and then we're going to go back into colder conditions. And I have been a little concerned about some of the fruit trees that require fewer chill hours coming out of bloom, but I've been talking to some other people who seem to think that the wetter soils we've had lately from the recent rain are keeping the peach trees in dormancy, so maybe less of a worry than I thought. Now, some of you may have your own opinions about that, but that's something that I'm looking at. We go to the next slide. There's an accumulation of chill hours. That's the next slide. This is the frost side. The 90%. No, go on to the frost. Yeah, there we go. The frost pattern shows that for most of our region, except for Florida, we have a 90% chance of having another frost before the winter season is over. So we're not going to get too excited about starting to plant too early. There's always a move to do that, but keep an eye on the weather conditions. For the last freeze at 50%. This is a 32-degree freeze. You can see most of southeast Alabama, most of southern Georgia, and the coastal areas of South Carolina. The last freeze doesn't really happen until late February, early March. We're a long ways from that yet. So we're not thinking at this point that we're out of the frost season yet. Now, if we go on to the next one, just wanted to talk briefly about chill hours. This is a map I put together for the fruit and vegetable growers in Savannah for a couple weeks ago. Shows that the trend in chill hours in a lot of the southeast is decreasing. This is from hourly data from the airports at Columbia and Macon. And you can see that there's still a lot of year-to-year variability, but there's definitely a downward trend. And peach producers are responding to that by planting varieties that require fewer chill hours. If we go to the next slide, shows the chill hours this year so far. The temperature graph there on the left shows Peach County, which I've been showing consistently through the months. And this shows that we're definitely better off this year than last year. This graph was put together before this weekend's chill, so it certainly would have climbed up on the top of that red envelope for a little bit. Now, as we get to warmer temperatures, it's going to flatten out, and then it will probably continue upwards after that towards the end of February. But overall, things are looking good for chill hour accumulations. I think most producers are pretty happy with that. And if you look at the chill hour departure map from the Midwest Regional Climate Center, you can see that most of the region is near normal to above normal in the chill hour accumulations. Florida has been a little bit behind, but I think they don't get a lot of chill hours anyway. So, I think definitely been doing better than in some previous years. And if we go on, here's my summary slide, and I will let you read that at your leisure and turn it over to Karin. I'm really interested to hear about the year in review.
Hey, Karin, we can't hear you yet.
All right, can you hear me now?
Yes.
I've been clicking on the microphone and it won't change. I'm like, what's wrong with my clicker? So appreciate you all inviting me to come and speak to you today about a brief summary of what we saw across the Southeast in 2023. Next slide, please. All right, so just overall in general for the year as a whole, the contiguous US had above average temperature year. It was fifth warmest on record, about 2.5 degrees Fahrenheit above average. The bulk of the record heat was across the south central portion of the country as well as parts of the Northeast, but the Southeast clearly had second, third warmest year on record, and several other states that were in the top 10. So it was definitely a warm year overall for the Southeast. Next slide. Zooming in a little bit closer to home, we're looking at the 129-year time series of temperatures across the Southeast with a trend over the last 40 years showing an increasing trend in temperatures with quite a bit of interannual variability. The map on the right is the county map of ranks for temperatures. So we saw in the southwestern portion of the Southeast, we saw some record heat as well as along the coastal portions of Florida and up in the North Carolina and Virginia. So second warmest year on record on average for the Southeast, about 2.5 degrees above average. If we look at individual seasons, we saw that the winter of 22-23 was fifth warmest for the region. Spring was above average overall, and Florida had its fourth warmest spring. Summer was above average, with Florida again having their second warmest summer, and fall was above average. So really nothing overall on average, near average. It was either above average or close to record warmth. All right, next slide, please. Looking at precipitation on a whole for the US, it was below average, but certainly regionally there was a lot of variability. South Carolina was the only state across the Southeast to rank wetter than average for the year. Some states were slightly below average or near average overall. Next slide. So across the Southeast for the year on a whole, we saw a near average year. Again, regional variability with wetter conditions along the coast, the East Coast and the eastern coast of Florida, and drier conditions on the western coast of Florida, the Gulf Coast, and into portions of the central Southeast. The time series on the left-hand side of the 129-year record shows all that year-to-year variability with a near average year overall and a slightly a trend towards getting a little bit wetter over the last 40 years. Looking at the seasons for the Southeast, winter of 22-23 was average on whole with dry conditions across Florida and Alabama. Spring was near average. Summer was also near average, but Florida was second wettest, and it was also wet in parts of Tennessee, Georgia, and South Carolina. And as was already mentioned earlier in this presentation, fall, we had below average precipitation across large portions of the region. Record dry conditions, in fact, across portions of Tennessee and northern Georgia, and drought certainly expanded throughout much of the Southeast during the fall season. Couple of points to note about precipitation across the region. April 12th, 13th, more than 25 inches of rain fell at the Fort Lauderdale Airport in Florida, which was a 1 in 1,000 year event, and that smashed their one-day record of 14.59 inches from April 25th of 1979. Fort Lauderdale also had its wettest year on record because it wasn't just a one event situation. They stayed wet for most of the year and had multiple significant heavy rainfall events. They had 113.61 inches of precipitation for the year, while ironically just 100 miles away to the west, Naples on the Gulf Coast side of Florida observed their driest year on record with only 30.48 inches total. And that's a difference of nearly 7 feet of precipitation, depending on which coast you lived on. Also on December 17th, there was more than 16 inches of rain that fell between Charleston and Georgetown, South Carolina. And it flooded neighborhoods and trapped residents, and a few areas reported rainfall rates of 6 inches in 6 hours, which is just crazy. All right, next slide, please. All right, looking at drought more closely and the evolution of it throughout 2023, we see the time series from January to December. About 21% of the Southeast was in drought at the beginning of 2023, and that coverage ranged from about 10 to 20% over the first 5 months of the year. And then sufficient rainfall during the summer months brought that down quite a bit. It increased again, as we mentioned, in the fall, and we had about 62% of the Southeast in moderate to exceptional drought by November 21st, which you can see this aerial distribution of that in the map on the right-hand side of the slide. This was the peak coverage and peak intensity for the year, and then some precipitation that we received in December helped bring that down just a little bit, and we ended the year with about 33% of the region in drought. Next slide. All right, looking at Puerto Rico and looking at the same types of graphics, the time series on the left-hand side, we saw maximum drought coverage at about 45% on April 4th, and that's the moderate drought. There was a small amount of severe drought that was present in June and early July, and then it increased a little bit in late July and into August, and you can see that extent of severe drought in the August 1st map on the right, and you can see the maximum extent of drought from the April 4th drought monitor there. Next slide, please. All right, looking at hurricanes and tropical systems in the Atlantic Basin, as many of you know, it was a very active season with 20 named storms, and that's the 4th highest number of named storms in a year on record. In total, there were 7 hurricanes, 3 major hurricanes. Fortunately for coastal portions of the US, the tracks did not overly impact coastal regions, which is both good and bad. I mean, it certainly likely contributed to some of the below average precipitation that portions of the Gulf Coast states in the Southeast didn't receive in the fall, but certainly damage and flooding was avoided to a large extent. We saw of the landfalling systems, we had Hurricane Idalia, tropical storms Harold and Ophelia, Harold impacted Texas and the southern plains in late August. Tropical storm Ophelia made landfall in eastern North Carolina and moved up the East Coast. Ophelia brought heavy rain and flooding from North Carolina all the way up to Massachusetts, resulting in significant damage and power outages. On August 30th, Hurricane Idalia made landfall in the Big Bend region of Florida as a Category 3 hurricane, and this is the strongest hurricane to hit the region in more than 125 years. And the satellite image on the right-hand side is a GOES 16 view of Idalia approaching Florida's west coast, while Category 4 Hurricane Franklin churned in the Atlantic, and it remained in the Atlantic. So we were fortunate there as well. All right, next slide, please. Looking at tornadoes, overall, we saw almost 1,300 tornadoes for the year across the contiguous U.S. October through December counts are still preliminary and yet to be verified. This is about near average. In general, portions of the Midwest and Dixie Alley were had above average tornadoes for the season. One significant tornado outbreak occurred in late March from the 24th to the 26th across the Southeast, and it caused severe damage in Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. There were a total of 41 tornadoes. On March 24th, an EF4 tornado led to 16 fatalities in Rolling Fork, Mississippi. That caused heavy damage to many homes and businesses. There was also an EF3 that touched down along the Alabama-Georgia border near the towns of Lanett, Alabama, and West Point, Georgia, the morning of the 26th. The most significant damage occurred along Highway 29, just north of West Point, where several homes were destroyed. Estimated peak winds in the area were about 150 miles per hour. These tornadoes caused significant damage to homes, vehicles, businesses, infrastructure, and human impacts as well. In total, for this multi-day outbreak, there were 21 fatalities reported and dozens of injuries. On April 30th, there was a state of emergency declared after a rare EF3 tornado touched down in Virginia Beach, and that destroyed more than 100 structures. So that was an unusual event. On June 18th, an EF3 tornado in Loudon, Mississippi resulted in 25 injuries and 1 fatality. And the strongest tornado identified during the month of July was rated EF3 and tracked about 16 miles across Nash and Edgecombe counties in eastern North Carolina on July 19th. This tornado destroyed several manufactured homes in the community of Dorches. Other homes sustained major structural damage, including the collapse of exterior walls. Of note, the tornado produced significant damage to a large Pfizer manufacturing plant. It supplies about 25% of all sterile injectable medications used by hospitals nationwide. And so there were medications that were damaged and deemed unusable from this event. This was the first EF3 tornado recorded in North Carolina in the month of July, and only the third tornado of EF3 and greater strength recorded in the state during meteorological summer and since 1950. There were at least 16 injuries, no fatalities from this destructive tornado. And then, of course, the year ended with a potent tornado outbreak across the Southeast on December 9th. There was an outbreak of 39 preliminary tornadoes across central Tennessee, southern Kentucky, central Mississippi, and southeastern Alabama, and the western Florida panhandle. Damage from this produced, there were several EF0s, 1s, 2s, one EF3, and one of the EF2 tornadoes impacted Madison, Tennessee, destroying some homes and businesses and vehicles. It injured 22 people, resulted in 3 fatalities. Another impactful tornado was an EF3 that hit Clarksville, Tennessee, damaging or destroying a bunch of homes and outbuildings. This tornado injured 62 and resulted in 4 fatalities. So a pretty active year tornado-wise as well. Looking at the next slide, we see just in general tornado tracks, how long-lasting they were as well as their intensity. And if you look across the Southeast, there are several long-lived tornadoes of EF3 strength across Alabama and Georgia. Certainly the Rolling Fork Mississippi tornado that was the EF4, the red track. But overall, I don't think it was nearly as active as last year, but still an active season tornado-wise across the Southeast. And then next slide, looking at disasters, billion-dollar disasters across the US on a whole, it was certainly a record year. We had 28 total disasters identified that exceeded the previous record, which was 22 events in 2020. By far, the leading disaster type was severe storms. We totaled 17 of them across the country, with 4 flooding events, 2 tropical cyclones, 2 tornado outbreaks, a winter storm, a wildfire, and 1 drought heat wave event. Billion-dollar disasters that impacted the Southeast specifically included the Fort Lauderdale flooding event that I mentioned just a few minutes ago, Hurricane Idalia that hit central Gulf Coast of Florida, and the southern and eastern severe weather event that occurred in early March. And that event had a cost loss of about $6 billion associated with it. And then my next slide is the takeaways, which also has some links to some relevant websites that you can peruse at your leisure. But other than that, next slide, thank you. My contact information is listed there. And if you want to see more of our monthly and annual climate reports, feel free to visit the URL listed on this slide. And with that, I will turn it over to Meredith.
That's great. Thank you so much, Karin, for that excellent overview. And also many thanks to our regular speakers, Todd, Pam, and Chris. My name is Meredith Muth. I work at NOAA's National Integrated Drought Information System, NIDIS, and we co-organize this webinar series with the National Weather Service and the Southeast Regional Climate Center. If you have any questions or comments for our speakers, please enter those into the question box at this time. We will provide to you a webinar summary and recording. Feel free to share. That will be posted on drought.gov. We have a couple of webinars coming up we're very excited about. First will be our an overview of the Southeast context in the National Climate Assessment. The 5th National Climate Assessment was just released late last year, and it is the U.S. government's preeminent report on climate change impacts, risks, and responses. So please don't miss that. And then as we move into spring, we'll hear a little bit about the pollen season and the U.S. Phenology Network. And then also we'll do a little bit more of a discussion on tornado vulnerability in the Southeast. And I think today we touched on that quite a bit. And if you have any questions or comments, please remember to take a survey that will pop up right at the end. Right now we'll go to our questions. Our first question I will direct to Todd at the River Forecast Center. This is related to flooding in Charleston. Was the flooding in Charleston area associated with Hurricane Ophelia?
I would have to look back at that. You know, I know that we've had some flooding in Charleston, so I would have to dig into that, and because I don't know the specifics of going back to Ophelia. So I would, I'm afraid I can't answer that right now, but they're more than welcome to contact me. My contact information is on there, and we can talk more about that.
Great, thank you. Did any of our speakers also want to respond to that?
This is Chris. If I'm thinking of the right part of that flooding event, I believe there was significant flooding in Charleston Harbor during that event. And I believe at one of the gauges there in Charleston Harbor there was a record crest. I don't remember the exact details. It's in one of our monthly reports and in our seasonal report. And if anyone needs more information on that, I can point them in that direction. Also, the South Carolina State Climate Office has a detailed report on that event that I think also provides some details on the flooding as well.
Great. And in our webinar recap, again, we will have links to all of these different reports and documents and websites that our presenters have mentioned. The next question I'm going to refer to Pam. So regarding high temperatures, decreased chilling hours, and producers selecting varieties with reduced chilling hours, what are your thoughts about late season polar vortex events that have been occurring in recent years?
That's an excellent question, and I don't have a good answer. One of the theories about global warming is that since the Arctic is warming faster than the equator is, we can expect to see more of these wavy weather patterns in the future, which means we'll have more periods of cold weather spliced between periods of warmer than usual weather. And so a lot of scientists, and not all of them, believe that this is the way it's going to increasingly look in the future, which is a real problem for peach producers because the warming of the winters is definitely occurring, and chill hours, as you saw in my slides, is going down. And so, you know, if you put in peach varieties that have fewer chill hour requirements, they're ready to go and bloom earlier in the year, and that makes them more vulnerable to these big switches in climate. I don't have an easy answer for that, but that is something that I think producers really have to look at.
Thanks, Pam. Next question is for Karin regarding the billion-dollar weather disasters. Regarding the figure you put up in the billion-dollar weather disaster, was the severe drought across much of the southern U.S. included in that list? I believe it was. I can even go back.
Yes, the southern Midwestern drought and heat waves event from the spring through the fall is identified. The icon shows up in southeastern Texas, but I think there's so many icons, they're trying to figure out where to put everything. So yeah, it did include the south central drought that occurred.
Okay, great. That's it for our questions today. Any last comments from our speakers? Oh wait, we have one more question coming in.
This is Chris, Meredith. Just real quick, I put this in the chat, so hopefully everyone can see it. The question regarding the Charleston flooding, I said that was Ophelia. That was actually Hurricane Idalia. I'm not good at keeping my hurricanes straight. I apologize, but that was Idalia. That was the Charleston flooding back in August, I believe. So I just wanted to clarify that.
Great, thanks. Okay, our last question, and this is a topic I know nothing about. I recently read an article in the Atlantic that discussed gray swan events as opposed to black swan events. What is the difference? Or do any of our speakers, are you familiar with this terminology?
I have never heard that term before, but it's an interesting thing. I'm going to have to go look for it now. Black swan events, of course, are things that just happen once, and they're just totally outside of expertise. But gray swan events maybe happen, my guess would be happen a little bit more frequently, but not all the time. But that's just my guess.
We have one more question that just came in. I'm going to direct this one over to Todd. A question about stream flow increases and risks of soil erosion. So this might actually be partly Todd and Pam. So soil erosion is a measure of stream. Okay, let's say a question about stream flow increases and risk of soil erosion is a measure of stream sedimentation recorded. If so, I wonder if NRCS's increase in implementing soil conservation could be measured.
As far as sedimentation in the river, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
It's
Meredith.
Probably more of a U.S. Geological Survey measuring, because some of the sites do measure turbidity and things like that. So that would probably be something I'd look to the U.S. Geological Survey for information on.
Yep, I agree, because we do quantity. They do more with the quality of the water and what's coming down in those areas. And we address it when it affects their rating curves. If it changes the bed of the rivers and so forth, so it changes our forecasting. So we work closely with the USGS to address those issues.
Okay, great, thank you. Any last comments for our panelists from our panelists before we close this up?
Hey, Meredith.
Yeah, go ahead, Victor.
Yeah, hi. I just want to comment on the question that was addressed to Pam about the with the overall warming, I guess, and the lower chill hours, and perhaps a greater danger, to late season freezes. I think that's a great question. I think, yes, we're seeing that. Overall in general, yes, we're seeing warmer temps, and the amount of chill hours are, dwindling or declining every year. But having said that, I think we were still seeing, the same amount or perhaps even more extreme events, per year. And I think first and foremost, or one of the foremost extreme events, we're seeing is our late season freezes. I think we've had numerous of those in the Southeast since, I'm thinking perhaps 2004. I forget that was the year that the Masters in Augusta, that first week of April, I believe, had really, really cold temps or record low temps. So yeah, we've seen a lot of late season freezes lately. It seems like they're in the Southeast U.S. and with the chill hours, dropping each year, and perhaps the strawberries or the fruit or the vegetable, perhaps, not being adapted to the, cold temps. These late season freezes that are coming in are really having significant impacts. But I think it's a great question. And I think something that going forward is probably going to be a big issue for producers in the Southeast, in this overall warming environment, how do we mitigate or adapt to these late season freezes, which are probably going to still keep occurring, in the face of or in spite of, the overall warming trend.
Thanks.
Hope that helps.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, and with that, I'd like to once again thank our speakers and thank all of you for joining us today. And we look forward to hopefully having you join us on February 27th for our next monthly webinar. Have a wonderful day.